Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to enjoy this session on the impact of the pandemic on senior leadership. My name is John Oates. I'm the Fire Chief in East Hartford, Connecticut, and a member of the FRCE's Behavioral Health Advisory Committee, and I'll be the moderator and chat moderator for the day. You folks are fortunate enough, following up after Jason's great presentation on resilience, you're fortunate enough to be joined today and be able to listen to a panel of chiefs from across the country that will share with you what they experienced and what they did from a senior leadership perspective, both individually and organizationally, to get their organizations and themselves through the pandemic. With us today is Chief John Butler, Fire Chief, Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department, Chief Lillian Bonsignore, Chief of EMS, Fire Department, New York City, Chief Harold Scoggins, Fire Chief, Seattle Fire, and Chief John Sullivan, Fire Chief of Brookline, Mass. With that, I'd like to hand it off to Chief Bonsignore for her comments.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. What a great topic to be talking about. You know, it's not typical that we talk about how such events really impact the senior leadership. The senior leadership is always pretty much on the hook to make everything keep moving, and it is quite the ride sometimes. And I will tell you, as Chief Oates said, I'm Chief Bonsignore, Lillian Bonsignore from FDNY in New York City, and by the time the pandemic had hit us, I was only in this position 8 months, so I was still, you know, getting my feet planted. I had been the chief of EMS training for 3 years prior. And I was really just trying to fit into this new position. This position I hold is the highest ranking EMS officer for the FDNY. So it's basically my responsibility to oversee all of EMS. So here we are 8 months into my new position, and all of a sudden we get hit with this, life-changing global pandemic that shuts the world down. And it wasn't just about wasn't just about New York City. We had been watching some of the stuff that was happening on the West Coast, but I will tell you, we had no idea what this was going to look like when it came. It literally came like a tsunami. It came in, you know, we saw a couple of things, a couple of indicators, and then it just hit us. And we normally do a call volume of around, 4,100 a day. So 4,100 calls in a 24-hour period. And at our highest, we got up to 6,500. So, it was quite challenging to try to keep up with all the call volume. So now I find myself in this new position, and we have a tremendous number of challenges in front of us. The call volume being the most significant, being able to keep up with all the calls. We noticed that our hospitals were starting to become overwhelmed, and that impacted our abilities on the other end. And as we continue through this process, our membership started getting sick. At one point, we lost about 25% of our workforce. And losing that many people to medical leave during an event like this made it quite challenging. So there were a couple of things that we were able to do. One was, we started looking inside. We took all of the inside people, all the offline position people who are EMTs and paramedics, and we put them out into the field. So we ran like 2 separate waves, actually 3 if you count our NAC units, but 3 separate waves of additional staffing. One being the folks that were working on inside positions. The second wave being another, couple weeks down the road from that one was all the folks that were in training. We had some new classes in training that were finishing up, so we expedited their training program, and we were able to put them out a couple weeks later. And right from the beginning, we had ordered some mutual aid. We activated mutual aid fairly, I guess, early in the event. In fact, so early, I think some people thought we were a little premature, because we hadn't been seeing the high numbers by the time we ordered the aid, but we did have a fairly good idea of how difficult this was going to be. So by the time we were hitting the highest of our call volume, our mutual aid started to arrive from all over the country. The mutual aid that came in created some challenges because we needed to be able to dispatch them within our city and make sure that they were going to the closest call, the most appropriate call, and the fact that they had come from all over the country, created, or this challenge that we had. We were able in the very early stages, our tech team was able to develop a mobile CAD system, which we put in the cell phones and allowed for us to dispatch these additional units just as though they were ours with a GPS and all. So they were incredibly helpful, and we'll forever be grateful for them coming in and giving us a hand during this very difficult time. We lost several EMTs. We lost 5 EMTs along the way. We suffered a couple of suicides along the way. It was very, very challenging. And having only been in this position 8 months and then having to face this just global event, I found myself feeling very stressed, challenged. I am now in charge of one of the largest EMS systems in our country, and we are seeing one of the worst things we've ever seen in our EMS history. And now I have to navigate the system through these challenges. We went from normal EMS to wartime EMS in a matter of a couple of days. And wartime EMS is a very fast-paced, very uncertain type of event, and where information is going out very, very quickly, and it's going out in a form of direction. And if you remember, when we first started getting hit, the CDC and the WHO were making lots of different edits and changes to the information. They were learning as they were going as well. So, what we put out as far as information, what we put out in the morning may not have been the same updated information that was in the afternoon. So, we were putting out a lot of information in a very short period of time. And the way we were able to navigate this at the most senior level was to really come together. We had to come together, and we worked together in a very small group, day and night. It was not unusual for us to be working 20 hours a day and having meetings at 11:30 at night to figure out what else needed to be done as this was unfolding. And we were seeing the other issues that came along with this pandemic, issues that maybe we had not faced before. So we found strength in each other, and we were able to share our ideas freely and in a trusting environment, so that when you're throwing ideas out there, sometimes they're crazy ideas, right? But that's how you get ideas. So we're throwing ideas out there. We're talking about the different things that need to happen strategically and operationally. And we are able to feed off each other and just kind of rely on our own backgrounds and our own histories. You needed to find somebody you trust in order to get you through, because there just is no time or opportunity to be stressed or allow these challenges to be an obstacle. There is no opportunity for that. You have to just kind of buckle down and keep going. And we did that. And as the challenges continued, we continued to problem solve along the way. So we found that a lot of our members didn't want to go home, right? And that was very new for us. We've seen large scale events before, but none of this scale where people didn't want to go home. They were afraid to go home and bring this virus back to their families. They started sleeping in their cars, and we needed to establish a housing program, which we were able to do, so that we can have our members stay someplace, either for quarantine or just a shower and some rest, because everybody was working, pretty much all the time. We saw that, the mental health of our members was really something that was starting to become evident. And we're life-saving people. No matter whether you work fire, EMS, or police, if you're a first responder, you're somebody who believes in saving lives. And the fact that, there were a lot of people dying, like we've seen a lot of death during this process. And it was hard for our members to really accept that, a lot of the folks that they were trying to save just weren't savable. And it was a heavy load. So we actually created one of the largest active member peer support groups around. And we did this during the pandemic. And that was very helpful for us to get our peers out there, just making sure that they're able to take care of each other and connect them with the resources that they needed. It came and it was a very challenging month, and then it started to decrease. And we're here, and luckily we're here, right, able to talk about some of the lessons learned along the way. But it's not over. It's just not over. We're still there. We still have to be aware of our situations and take appropriate precautions. But I will tell you that this was one of the most challenging situations I've ever seen. And I've been in EMS for over 30 years, and this was fast paced and hard. But, thankfully we have a great team that was around us, and we were able to navigate this, and we learned a lot. And I think we'll be able to leave these lessons behind for the next group of leaders, which I think is also an important piece. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Chief Butler.
Thank you, Chief Bonsignore. You mentioned a number of things, Chief, that I'll add to and echo and kind of build on. Many of us here today have seen complicated events or incidents, and many of us seen complex incidents and events. The ongoing, and that's one of the things that was just emphasized, the ongoing pandemic, because we're not technically out of it yet, brought forth complications and complexities. And it's called a pandemic for a reason. We all struggled through it in one capacity or the other. On February 26th of 2020, at around 1:24, I sent a text. Another chief officer, our health and wellness officer, Chief Bailey, and I were texting, and he notified me that in the area we would be standing up a COVID-19 planning team. And I brought up February 26th at 1:24 because that's the first time I've ever texted the words, "What's a COVID-19?" And I still have that text in my phone. What's a COVID-19? Up until February 26th, I knew what the coronavirus was. I had been tracking it, like many of us, internationally. But I think that was the first time I had seen the words COVID-19 inserted into a sentence or a statement. I saved that text, and I look at it often. Like, it wasn't that long ago that this is how precipitous this thing came at us. On February 26th of last year, I didn't even know what the word meant, and now here we were. So we're all struck by it, and the title of this panel is about how it impacted leadership. So I'll try to stay on point. One thing I think we did as an organization early, the organization I'm in, is we established a strategic priorities chief. Strategic priorities chief, which was, for lack of a better word, the czar, the COVID czar. That was the quarterback. In fact, that might have been even considered the coach. Deputy Chief Fred Brendel, who stood up our strategic priorities center, for lack of a better word. He and his team liaised with the health department, with the agency. We got our arms around PPE. And as of today, and I'll bounce around a little bit, but as of today, after 15 months, there was no time we were out of PPE. We never lost a supply chain. Sometimes they became very thin, and just a hair away from running out of PPE, but we never did. We had a real strong logistics and support team. I remember the supply chain, our logistics folks utilizing T-shirts and cutting T-shirts that typically would have been issued to firefighters and making face coverings. Repurposing T-shirts to do mass face coverings when that was the novel prophylactic or protection from the virus. We pivoted. We were resilient, like many of you. You know, some of the stressors didn't all come from the job. As was just talked about, people wondered if sleeping in their vehicles, sleeping in hotels, and other setups. One thing we were concerned about is advocating for sleeping, especially of those who were known to be positive with COVID-19, to quarantining in hotels, you know, by themselves or whatever. We're concerned about the, you know, feeding and watering and caring for folks. So while we had access to many hotels, we were real strategic on suggesting, you know, you go, you know, hunker down in a hotel by yourself while you're having some difficulty breathing or other, you know, conditions. But the stressors were all over, you know, like many of you, our policies and procedures changed a little bit. We became nimble. Instead of sending the engine company and the medic unit into the quote unquote hot zone, into the homes, you know, we would send a smaller team, 1 or 2 people. And at some point, you know, when dispatch suggested CPPE, as in COVID PPE, when all the calls, or most of the calls, the recommendations of CPPE, it almost became, I don't want to, like white noise. It just became, you know, par for the course. You know, our partner agencies, we have the police department lost 1 member of their team. The sheriff's department lost 1. And as the fire chief and the senior team, this was always on our mind. You know, we knew that, you know, peer support would be important, but weren't going to push it on people. You know, it was always there. You know, the thing with the international pandemic that comes around 100 years, not many people are not affected. You know, there was a time, personally speaking, there was a time, I remember this vividly, on a Sunday, I was just getting bombarded with phone calls and, you know, telecons and Zoom calls and everything else. I was in my basement and just getting the beat down from the managing the COVID pandemic in the fire department. And I said, you know, I'm going to go out for a run. And I went out for a run, and I found myself, I mean, like, what is that, sweat or is that tears? You know, and I found myself weeping, crying while I was running. Nothing was wrong with me. You know, nothing was physically wrong with me or anyone I knew. The agency was at it, but the stress, the overwhelming amount of, I keep saying, beat down, and it hit. I'm like, why am I, like, you know, coming down on myself like that? So if it was happening to me, I can only imagine what was happening on the front lines. You know, I ran a few calls. I went out there with some EMS units and fire suppression pieces and ran some calls with them. I never made entry. I stayed out with the engine crew, or I just watched their operation. And I'd see these members of my agency taking multiple showers a day during their shift, you know, after a number of these calls. You know, something as simple as a shower, which is usually refreshing, was an indication of how, you know, what was going on out there. That you have to decon like that multiple times a day was just quite a bit. You know, our senior leadership team, they carried the water. You know, they tried their best to communicate and message and to be chief repeating officers. But the challenges, one was already mentioned. I think it was mentioned a few minutes ago. The message changed. It changed a number of times during an operational period. At times, the troops thought, you know, it was us in headquarters just making it up. You know, they can't get it right. In the morning they're saying this, in the afternoon they're saying this, and most often we're pass-throughs. And it's real hard to be a operations deputy chief or battalion chief out there carrying a message that is changing so frequently. I have been to combat as a former Marine. I've been to combat twice, and this is the closest I think I've seen of that kind of experience, where the battle, the playing field just was continuously changing, you know, and things were very fluid and dynamic. How we carried the message. Some of the organization would have wanted to see it in the IAP format. Others thought the IAP format was just white noise, and they wanted to see it verbal and teleconferences, or, you know, just different modalities of sharing the message. And so what we had to do was try them all and do them all, and, you know, continue with the IAP as the framework, as the backbone, but different ways to share the same information, because, you know, everything was a stressor. Moving into where we are today, I mean, in 2020, my organization had 132 positives. Okay, today we have one that's on the books. We saw some significant drop since you know, January, from 30 to 1 to 1. I think we hit 8 back in April, and now we're back at 1. The vaccinations change was a game changer, but you know that, and I do as well. Like many, you know, we kind of hovered around a 70% compliance. I'll try not to get on the soapbox, but I will associate the 30% with teetering on a public trust. The community expects that we're healthy and we're not harnessing, you know, disease, if you will, when they call 911 and we enter their homes. I think there's like I said, I'm staying away from politics, religion, or whatever. As EMTs, as clinicians, as medical professionals, you know, I would have hoped and expected a higher number of compliance with the vaccines. It probably will go up. I hope it does. I hope we keep at it. But, you know, in our industry, I think it's real important that some of those successes we gained during the tough part of the pandemic, we should celebrate them by becoming a part of the solution and getting vaccinated. There's a lot more I could talk about. Contact tracing. Contact tracing got a little weird, you know, with contact tracers going direct with employees as a person versus their employer. So contact tracers telling frontline personnel, you should quarantine, you should not go to work tomorrow, and how it impacted staffing and the employee. That was another stressor, because sometimes we're not on the same page. The organization, contact tracing, and some other public health pieces. Most often we were, sometimes we were not. The stressors, like we keep talking about, came from all areas, and I'm sure all of you can relate to a lot of what I had to say. I think I'll stop there. I think that's all I'll share for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Butler. So my name is Harold Scoggins, Seattle Fire Chief, and I'm going to try not to echo many of the things that you've already heard, but I guess we as fire service professionals, we must think alike as I listen to the comments. You know, here in Seattle, I think we were on the front end of this, and we sent our first department-wide communication out on January 22nd that the novel coronavirus had landed in our region. Didn't know what that meant at that point in time. I mean, that's really early on in January, but we were trying to figure it out. And you know, I gotta thank our senior leaders and our team. We're blessed to have them because what we've done over the last 15 months, 16 months, 17 months has been absolutely incredible. Our Assistant Chief of Operations, Brian Hastings, our Assistant Chief of Resource Management, Willie Barrington, our Assistant Chief of our Fire Marshal, Tim Munnis, and our Executive Director of Administration, Helen Fitzpatrick. Our team worked tirelessly, along with just so many other folks in the organization, really trying to understand what was going on. But by February, we had an idea something really, really bad was happening, as I think we all watched the Life Care Center in Kirkland, which is a neighboring community. And we knew we needed to start it to pivot from our normal daily activities. So we immediately stood up our COVID-19 planning group, and our COVID-19 planning group was a key resource for us. They were going to look at our policies, our response policies, our PPE, our dispatch protocols, everything associated with COVID-19 was this COVID-19 planning group responsibility. And I can remember early on, we were changing policy daily or weekly. And as Chief Butler just mentioned, we were trying to figure out how to communicate with the organization. We were doing all of those things. Starting probably the second or third week of February, we had a department-wide Teams call that was happening weekly just so we can update on policy changes, and that's along with the dispatches and the memos and the IAP. But that personal message, hearing from the leadership of the organization and just being transparent and honest and saying we didn't know where this was going, hearing from our medical director, giving that medical advice every week, that was really big for us. And then we started to experience the exposure. And just to give all perspective, here in the Seattle Fire Department, we have about 1,100 sworn. So since the pandemic started, we have had 324 people off in quarantine or isolation, and we have had 65 people that have tested positive. So back in late February, early March, this is when we started to experience this. And because we were on the front end of this, there was not contact tracing set up. Testing wasn't set up. And I can remember one afternoon early on, we had a conversation with our team to stand up our COVID-19 exposure group. And this is a team of people inside the Seattle Fire Department, and they were going to do our contact tracing based on the guidance from the medical community and our medical director. Now, we knew this was going to be complicated because what do you do with people who have been exposed based on the guidance back at that time? And I'm thankful to the city of Seattle because things had really started to slow down in the country, and the Seattle signed a contract with one of the hotels in downtown Seattle. In case an individual could not isolate or quarantine at home or did not want to take it home, the city of Seattle contracted with an entire hotel. And I think by the end of it, we had contracts with 3. And this was full service. This was meals, this was cleaning, this was everything that could take care of an individual. And it gave us an opportunity to actually provide a safe space for a person to actually quarantine or isolate. So that was really important for us. And as we saw this continuing to escalate, you know, our folks are great with having great ideas, because one afternoon someone said, well, maybe we could do our own testing. This wasn't an EMT skill set, wasn't a firefighter skill set. So our paramedics partnered with our medical director, and we communicated with Seattle King County Public Health, and then the state of Washington Department of Health. And between Wednesday and Friday, we had approval to actually do testing. And this was in early March. And so we got the approval on that Friday. That Saturday, our folks were already doing the training and starting to do testing that Saturday. Initially, we deployed this as a measure to try to understand the spread of the disease here in the fire department and keep our responders safe. But the more and more testing we did, we trained other first responders here in the Seattle King County region. So, you know, police and firefighters and other responders from all around the region now had the ability to get tested. And then what we discovered was, you know, the spread is still happening in our assisted living facilities, our nursing homes, our adult family homes. So we eventually got permission to go into those facilities and try to serve those in the most need to do testing. And, you know, giving a shout out to Acting Captain Brian Wallace, who was really the architect of many of these programs that we deployed. So our teams, our mobile testing teams, started to do all of these things. Now, when we walked into the pandemic, we started to do a couple of things. We have a continuity of operations plan, our COOP plan, and I'm sure we all do. And in our COOP plan, you know, it called for us having 12 weeks of supplies based on a pandemic type scenario. And we did. We had 12 weeks of supply, but immediately our finance and administrative team started working the supply chains because we knew there were going to be delays on getting supplies. So they started working. We knew we had 12 weeks of supplies. We changed our response protocols through our dispatching. So all these things started to happen immediately. And our response protocols, how can we sustain that supply? And as Chief Butler mentioned, we deployed what we called a scout protocol. So that is 2 people go in to do the assessment, everyone else waits outside. And then with the assessment, they see if they can handle the response and get the patient package properly or not, or if everyone needed to come in. That way we were able to sustain our PPE for longer periods of time. So that really helped us. So by mid-March, April, we were doing weekly teleconference calls. We were updating policies weekly. Dispatches and memos were going out. Our dispatch protocols were changing. We had hotels booked, and we were now testing out in the community. And then what we saw is we kept hearing at that point in time in April and May that there wasn't enough testing to understand the rate of spread of the disease in community. So then we started to get really creative, and we said, well, we could probably do testing in the community, because all these things were still happening, and we knew for us to keep our firefighters safe, to understand the rate of spread in the community, we could help stand in the gap. And June 5th, 2020, we opened up our first community-wide testing site that was ran by Seattle Fire Department. So our firefighters, our medics, we hired over 100 registration techs from community. We partnered with AMR to get more folks, University of Washington, virology did all of our test reading. So the partnerships was growing. And as I look back, next Saturday will be a year. We have now tested over 758,000 people here in our community at our 4 Seattle Fire Department testing sites. We ended up opening 4 sites. 2 of those sites now have been transitioned to vaccine only. So as we watched the ebbs and flow of the virus and all the things that kept going on, we knew as the disease continued to spread and the vaccinations were progressing, that we could be a helper in that space too. So we submitted an application to the State Department of Health the weekend after Thanksgiving to actually be vaccinators. And that Friday is when we started the process. On January 9th, we were actually approved. And since then, our teams have vaccinated now over 138,000 people here in the community. And the city actually stood up at Lumen Field, which is right next to where the Seahawks play, Lumen Event Center, a community-led, city-led mass vaccination site that we got up as high as 8,000 vaccinations a day, which is actually really impressive. But the impact on leaders, our leaders that I named earlier, was absolutely incredible. We're fortunate to have so many caring people here in the Seattle Fire Department. Our CISM team and peer support team was led by firefighter Mike Washington, who recently retired, and Lieutenant Kim Leroy, who recently retired, and now led by Lieutenant Steve Yider. They were so spot on. Any person who went in quarantine or isolation, that team of peer supporters reached out and contacted them to make sure that they were doing okay. They also did the same thing for our senior leaders. It was not uncommon for me to have a knock at my door with someone checking in and just to see how I was doing, to kind of get us through it, because the weight was heavy for our entire team. And the weight still continues to be heavy as we continue to continue to navigate our way through this pandemic and through this virus. We're seeing some really positive results where our numbers are going way down. I think our mayor announced yesterday that 62% of the residents of Seattle are now fully vaccinated, and 76% have received the first dose. And by mid-June, we will pass that 70% threshold and continue to climb. I think here in Seattle Fire Department, the vaccination was well received, and I don't know the exact numbers, but we have a pretty high rate of people that have been vaccinated. But our team stayed close during this period of time. Probably the first 4 months, our team worked every day. Just every single day, planning, coordinating, organizing, making sure the department was taken care of as best we could. So this was a pretty incredible time for our nation and our country, our nation and the world, actually. And, we think that we worked hard to serve our firefighters, and we worked hard to save our community. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Chief Sullivan.
Thank you, Chief. One of the benefits of going last in the line is, you get to hear all of the great stuff that went before you. And, thank you to all the chiefs and all the great work that was done. I represent a little bit different demographic. I see FDNY and Fairfax County and Seattle, all big metropolitan city departments with a lot of resources to bring to bear, and with a lot of responsibilities because of the size of your communities and just the exponential amount of work and chaos that goes along with being in a major metropolitan city. Here in Brookline, we are a suburb of Boston, literally surrounded by Boston on 3 sides, and we have all of the trappings of the major city with very little of the resources. So I'm sitting on a department of about 153 members, and so a lot of the responsibilities that were needed in every department that my colleagues here have talked about, there just wasn't a lot of ability to decentralize. So the impact fell a great deal on the shoulders of myself and just a couple of other key leaders within the department. The same things have to happen. The same decisions have to be made. And all of the chiefs here have talked about the fact that we were creating policy and we were making decisions with very little guidance and oftentimes on the fly. It was as best as we could for the information that we had at the time. And, our firefighters, all of our firefighters and EMS personnel were counting on us to have, seriously thought out decisions made on their behalf with very little information and very little expertise. I know I, for one, am not a public health expert. And, although I've got the gray hair, I have not lived through a pandemic before. And so, we were making this up on the fly and counting on the experts to give us good information. But quite honestly, as much as we scoured the news and the directives coming out of CDC and NIH and so on and so forth, and all of our agencies, we were tasked with sorting through and then creating a policy or creating an operational plan for a unique department, whether it's the EMS side of FDNY or a countywide department like Fairfax County with such an incredibly diverse demographic that you have to deal with, and then Seattle, Boston, the inner city urban challenges that come with that. I'm sitting here reminded of Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I think that the impact on me as the senior leader and the other senior leaders in my department and the other chiefs that I've been able to speak with about this is that I'm really proud of the work that was done in such a short period of time. Any loss of life, whether civilian or firefighter, EMT, is tragic. And to lose your life on an exposure to a communicable disease in a pandemic situation like this in service is heroic. The level of integrity and drive and purpose that I saw from our folks to come to work every day, despite the fact that this was an invisible killer that could potentially take you and your family out. That's something we're not used to. That is a level of responsibility and a level of challenge, at least for me as a chief. That weight was tremendous, and not having the resources to be able to bear and get a ability to just take a hotel and put everybody up in a hotel and give them meals and take care of all of their needs and so on and so forth. I was at a point where I'm tasking my logistics folks, which is basically the 3 people I have in training division, see how many N95s or KN95s we can give to, firefighter so-and-so to bring home for his 14-day quarantine so that he could at least keep his wife and children from getting, exposed to this virus. We all talked about phone calls at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, trying to make decisions that were not in my wheelhouse. After 37 years in the fire service, this was not something I had necessarily prepared for, but I had prepared for it. As I look back in hindsight, all of the networking that I did over the years, all of the trainings that I did over the years, this might not have been a large scale fire incident or hazmat incident or whatever. But the complexities and the decision-making kind of matrix was fairly well the same. What is the best information I have right now? What is going to give me the greatest impact on both the individual and the community? I, in a way, had a double burden, but also an additional resource in that I'm also the emergency management director for the town. And that's just an ad hoc group of people that come from different departments when we have a winter snowstorm. That's basically what that has been in our history for forever. We're not dealing with the hurricane for
I think Chief Sullivan's
safety programs that came in and did additional work to keep the town up and running. And so, I think that the impact on the leadership was both a very draining, tiresome, weighty feeling that we had of having our folks' lives in our hands under a situation that was out of our control. I can train our folks to go into a burning building or go into an EMS call that is a normal kind of, EMS call and into a hazmat situation and kind of look at the variables and figure it out. We were talking about an invisible killer that, potentially could not only impact the safety of our membership, but also their loved ones. And to me, that was an incredibly weighty burden early on. I have to give credit to my local, the union folks for unprecedented cooperation, over the course of these first months. I canceled all vacations, all personal days, all everything stopped. No swaps, no nothing. I ended up having to take, because of the initial exposures, double company houses and actually split a double company house. And I took over the public library across the street and brought an engine company, and they were in the children's reading room for a month, working out of the public library. And I took over an area in one of the public schools and put another engine company over there because one person came to work, didn't know that they had been exposed and were diagnosed with COVID-19. And I had to put 9 other people out on quarantine for 14 days. And for me, 154 member department, at one point at the peak, I had 44 members on quarantine at the same time. Overall, we had 17 members, and thankfully, none of them were seriously affected, but 17 members who did come down with COVID-19. And so, I applaud this senior leadership group here and all of you out there who are listening, who were part of this response, because this was not something that most of us anyway had really to any great extent prepared for. Like Chief Butler, my PPE ran very dangerously low, even with drawn back responses. But we made it through, and hopefully we're better prepared for the next eventuality. and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about what our capacity is to be dynamic on the fly outside the fireground. We're very adept at going at a unique situation on the fireground and applying all of the tools that we learn in training and we've learned through experiential opportunities over the years. This one, we were forced to make those same kinds of critical decisions, and Chief Butler talked about it a little bit, almost like a battleground, very much a battleground feeling of, all right, the wind just shifted, the enemy just pulled a counterattack on us. We have to life-saving measures. We have to make a decision on how to flank with it, and with very little information. So again, my congratulations to this team and all of the things they did for their communities, and just listening to the stories about what you went through. And we all watched, right? We all watched as this thing took over Washington State and moved, very quickly over to New York, New Jersey, and just to sit and watch and wait. That was one of the other things, we all were watching the news. I'm watching New York City going, holy mackerel, this is coming. I had to look up, our first conversation in town here was on January 25th. And I had to look it up because all you guys had to write your first numbers. But fantastic work all around. It's not done, as both Chief Bonsignore and Chief Butler and Scoggins said. We're not done, but we're a lot better prepared, and we're a lot better focused. And I think we'll be able to articulate to the next generation of leadership what it was like, and how they can learn the lessons from this. And that's really what this is all about. So John, I'll turn it back to you so we can answer questions here.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you all four of you for really, really insightful comments. And we have some questions from the chat box that we'll get to, but there's a couple things I'd like to probe that were comments that each of you that I think were insightful, that we could peel back a little bit, because I think there's some interesting things there. And I'll start with something that Chief Bonsignore offered, that making decisions, particularly at this criticality level, making decisions in a time with limited information, but in your quote, trusting environment and a freely exchange of idea. Could each one of you kind of talk about, what those early days in your approach to this and your teams, because each one of you obviously have really, really high quality leadership management teams, both labor and management, and kind of what that looked like, and what were perhaps maybe a couple, one or two things that you did to help build that environment, sustain that environment moving forward. And since Chief Bonsignore, it was your quote, I'll let you go first.
All right, thanks, Chief. That was actually one of the things that kept us solid, is just being able to talk freely to each other. And this, for a fire department our size, this was a medical event, right? So this is not something that most people were prepared for. This is very much in our wheelhouse. Like, we've dealt with infectious diseases before. We even had a case of Ebola come our way, and we had to deal with Ebola at some point. But this was something very, very different than that. We needed to pull all our senior leadership together and be able to, I think Chief Sullivan said, build it as we go, right? We had to come up with innovative ideas, and in a fly, because things were moving so quickly. I could tell you one of the largest challenges I was given up front was to socially distance EMS. How do you do that? Like, how do you socially distance 4,000 EMS people in a city this size? So, we had to come up with some ideas, and some of those ideas were not good ideas. And I'm not going to lie about that. Some of those ideas didn't work out so well. But on the backs of that, we were able to come up with real solutions, and real quick solutions. And we had to put our egos aside, because nobody in that room, from the most senior person to the most junior person, had experience with this. So we had to just put our egos aside. Everything was on the table, kick ideas around and try to run through scenarios quickly to make sure that we were making decisions that weren't going to put our people in more danger, because they were already in danger. And we were going to be able to navigate this thing. We didn't know how long it was going to be. We ended up having a really bad 1 month period, and then it started to kind of slide off. But at the time we were in the middle of it, it could have been 6 months of what we were seeing. We had no idea how long this was going to last. So we bound together and we put everything out there. And some of the things we put out there were just crazy ideas. Luckily there were other people in the room to say maybe not. But some of the ideas we did come up with collectively really helped us be successful during this very difficult time.
Awesome, thank you. Other chiefs, comments to that?
I think I wrote it down when Lillian was talking earlier. Trust. It came down to trust on a really basic, fundamental level between the troops and the leadership. I think everybody understood that we were making these decisions with not a lot of information, but that we were bringing our collective experiences and training together to make a decision for right now. I don't know how many times I said, I'm not going to chisel and granite here. Okay. If this isn't working right, we can change it tomorrow. And I think, generally speaking, we like things to be pretty solid. We like things to be vetted out pretty solid before we put people's lives on the line. But in this particular case, we were making decisions with the best information we could at the time, and just trusting that we were going to be able to come out on the right side of it, and then being able to adapt. So to me, it really, John, to your point, came down to trust.
I'll quickly say, for the sake of brevity, decentralizing was key. Empowering the small unit leader. When at our training academy, when we had an outbreak that impacted and affected, got a pop-up box here. So when we had an outbreak that affected the academy, it was the chief training officer and his team who helped come up with solutions, to mitigate the outbreak. When it came to PPE, our resource manager, she was the one that helped and leveraged our relationships. So without sounding repetitive, trust, and empowerment, know when to let go of the wheel and let those unit leaders that are closest to the issues help solve them.
Yeah, and I'll just build briefly on Chief Butler's comments. The courage to make some really hard decisions and step into some new spaces that we hadn't been in before. And so that took courage for the people offering up the idea and the willingness to do it. When we got approval to start doing testing back in February, I believe, of 2020, well, this isn't something that firefighters did. Put swabs up someone's nose to understand, so stepping into new places, and for our leadership, understanding that these were those moments that we needed to block and tackle to make a space for our people to deploy these new ideas and get people out of the way. But the community trust played a big part in it too, because, I think fire agencies all around the world do such an amazing job in building that community trust. When the messaging went out that your local fire department was going to start doing testing, it was a natural transition. So that trust became very important too.
Absolutely, and I appreciate each one of those comments. And I'm gonna take a statement that Chief Butler offered in the his comments relative to actually getting out to exercise. And for a lot in senior leadership, the pandemic really did feel like the overwhelming beatdown of just like the nonstop everyday grind of what it was. And when you balance that with the organizational permissibility to be wrong decreases as your rank increases, that we're supposed to know everything and we're never supposed to. So for each of you, since we're really, trying to have a focus on how we improve the behavioral health of our organizations and us as individually as leaders, if you could share one or two things perhaps that you each did to help get through that slog that was April, May, and June, and when things were, or even March and February for some of us, and that epic, overwhelming, and I'm gonna just, that's stuck in my head, the overwhelming beatdown that was the early days and the persistence of COVID. Chief Butler, is your comments. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I mentioned briefly physical activity and getting out and ensuring that those who could have days off or telework or spread out their shift opportunities, obligations did so. In the same breath, we were having some staffing shortages like many others. So it's real tough to tell people, take all the time you need, yet we need folks for callback and holdovers and staffing and overtime. So that was continues to be a challenge. My agency, amongst many others, are continuing to struggle to staff up to 100%. But we're trying some different things. I'll tell you, there was a little bit of good when there was a lockdown. Being able to get out and the streets were kind of empty and sidewalks were somewhat empty and go out for a run or walk or bike or whatever. But that's not, that's not a pleasure for that reason. But yeah, so I've personally found that physical activity, physical fitness worked really well for me. But whatever it is that brings some self-care and joy, and I don't believe there's work-life balance. It's really work-life integration, and just trying to figure out how to integrate it, because it's never a balance. It's never 50-50, if you will. Just how do we integrate and navigate it, and our clergy, our peer support. We have behavioral health professionals then and now. So leveraging all of those resources were really important and continues to be.
Thank you, Chief. We got time for one other. So comment from.
Go ahead, Chief.
I just want to, I think it's important, thank you, Chief Scoggins. I think it's important for people to recognize that their senior leadership under all of this are people who have done this job and love this job, which is why we're still here. And I think at some point I was personally blamed for the pandemic. And my every single moment was dedicated to trying to keep them safe, because I love the people who do this job. And I know, there's always this management labor thing that goes on, but in the face of a pandemic, it's important to know that your senior leadership cares deeply about you. And as an EMT, a medic, a firefighter, but we have a collective mission, and we have to stay steady enough to be able to save all those people who put their lives in our hands. And sometimes these things compete with each other, right? Because the people who save lives also needed their lives saved at the same time. And it was a difficult balance to manage. And just to end that, I was not personally responsible for the pandemic, just so you know.
I thank goodness, but that friction of command that we often experience in times like that is difficult to walk through. We got about 2 minutes left. So Chief Scoggins, you had a comment. I'd like to hear it. Yeah. We can wrap up.
I was just going to put some layers on top of this pandemic, because it wasn't the only thing we were dealing with. Okay. When you layer on top of the protests for the loss of George Floyd that we experienced front and center here in Seattle, when we lost the use of one of our bridges that connects West Seattle to Seattle. And so we had that pressure, and we deployed additional units and put them in service, still in service today, because that bridge is still out of service. And then during the same time, a piece of our pier on the Seattle waterfront fell into the ocean. So when you layer all these things on top of each other, the stress was real. But one thing that helped for me, as John mentioned, was I had to commit to that exercise routine to blow off steam. Every morning at 5:30, I had to be up. I had to be working out, and I had to get a good sweat going to let some things go. But it was multiple layers during this period of time.
Outstanding.
I'll just say Sirius XM, Grateful Dead channel radio. That's how I got through it. Thanks, John.
Thank you. And it's, you know, all of those things taken together, and it is literally not just one thing. It's everything. Chiefs, I appreciate we're out of comment there, out of time. There are some comments in the chat that I will get answers back to those people because they cared enough to ask the question. Really appreciate your insights. Certainly, you know, impressed with the level of success for each one of your agencies. Thank you for giving up a chunk of your afternoon to support the First Responder Center, and good luck in what's next as we carry through the pandemic. Thank you.